Hey guys, what's up? It's River, and today we're doing a quick video on my Fuji X100F. This is one of my favorite cameras, but it takes a little bit of learning to do. It's not quite as straightforward. It's very easy to use, but it takes a little bit of tweaking and learning to get the exact perfect image and really maximize the sensor. So in this video, we're gonna go over how to maximize the sensor and get the best possible image out of this camera, how to set this camera up for different shooting environments, and a few interesting customizations that you may not know about. Without further ado, let's get into it. Also, just to let you guys know, there's a link in the description below for the best possible pricing on this camera. So if you are interested in getting this Fuji camera, be sure to check that out. So first, let's do a quick overview on where everything on this camera is. It is a beautiful piece of machinery, but if you're not used to using cameras like this, you may find yourself a little bit lost as to what does what. So starting off at the very top, this is the shutter button. So if you turn this dial right here, sorry, not the shutter button, the shutter dial, it can go to T, which is timed, B, which is bulb. These are super slow shutter speeds. You go in 1 second, 2 second, all the way up to 400th of a second. That is super duper fast. And now you wouldn't really use a shutter that fast in bright sunlight, and you would also cut out most of your motion blur. So depending on what exactly you're shooting, if your subject's fast moving, I would recommend doing 4000 if you have enough light. Generally, I like to shoot most of my street photography or even like my portrait stuff at 125 to 500. For street stuff that's moving really fast, I'll usually set it to about 500 of a second. Next, ISO. Now ISO on this camera is a bit tricky in terms of how to change it. The way you have to do it is this dial actually pulls up like this. So if you pull it up slightly, this little window right here will actually start to change the ISO. So if you just slightly pull up and then turn this dial, so just slightly pull up and turn, and you'll see that this ISO will actually change. And now this ISO, or at least on this camera, will go all the way up to 12,800. I don't recommend shooting on 12,800 because it'll just blow out all your photos, and you can get a much cleaner image at a lower ISO if you have enough light. And also you can go into H, which is extended ISO, and that will take your ISO up into 25,600 to 52,000. I definitely don't recommend shooting in that ISO unless you really need to, and A is of course auto. And if you go to L, that's 100 ISO, that is the lowest possible ISO. I generally like to set this camera and most of my cameras somewhere between 800 to 1,000, not because it's necessarily the cleanest, it's because generally I find with the type of aperture that I shoot on, I will usually need about 800 or 1,000. Some people I know will swear by only shooting at 400 ISO, but really ISO looks different on every camera, and in this camera I find 800 is a sweet spot, but some people like to shoot at lower ISOs. To be honest, there's been times where on bright days, I will even shoot on ISO as low as 200. Okay guys, next, this is my favorite part of this camera. This lens is absolutely awesome. It's a still fixed lens. It cannot be taken off, but it is a prime lens, so it is super fast. This ring right here has two handles, and if you turn these handles right here, it's kind of tough to grip the middle of that lens, so I usually like to use these handles to turn it. You can go up to f2.0. Now that is super shallow depth of field, and it is very fast and will let a lot of light in and go all the way up to 16, and if you go past 16, you hit A, and that's just auto aperture, where the camera will decide for you what the best aperture is, depending on light and all those other things. I generally, for street photography, like to be at about 5.6, but for portraits, I love doing 2 or 2.8, but again, it really depends. This is a 23mm lens, so I don't like to get super duper close up to my subjects because it will distort their face. I generally find 5.6 for somewhere in this range. I find after 8, I'm not really getting much light in, and also there's not enough depth of field and it loses that cinematic quality. And next, there is a little focus ring right here. If you're in manual focus mode, this will actually change your focus like any normal camera. But if you're not in manual focus mode, you can set it to a number of things. You can set it to change your digitally zoom in and out of your camera. It can change your film emulations, and I'll show you how to set up your focus ring next. And just a quick side note, there's a button right here. If you go to M, that's manual focus, C, continuous, S, single shot. Basically, if you get focus in single shot, it will get focus and it'll hold that for the rest of the shot, or until you try to focus again. C, it will continuously track or try to track. The focus in this camera, not the greatest. And lastly, manual, just you have to use this focus ring right here to manually change it yourself. So next, I want to teach you what this function button right here does. If you click into it, this menu will pop up. Again, I can show you, like we're at the LCD screen, and now if I click it, this will pop up, and this will give you control settings. You can have it standard, which it changes the default option according to selected shooting mode, which would be if you're in manual focus, it'll do that. If you're in autofocus, it'll change your digital settings, your digital zoom, but you can actually program it to change your white balance, your film simulation, your digital teleconverter, or you can just leave it off. I prefer to have it actually either change my film emulation or digital converter. So let me show you how that would work. So now if I'm in continuous or single shooting mode and I turn that dial, what you'll actually see is my film emulations will pop up, and I can choose Provia, Vivid, Standard, Soft, whatever I like. And this is really, really useful for pointing your camera at a scene and then just quickly figuring out what film simulation looks the best in that particular setting. So that's really useful. And if I hit this button right here, this menu will pop up and I'll go into digital teleconvert. And I have to make sure I'm either in C or S. And from there, I can actually zoom into my photo or out. Again, I would only use this in a pinch, because that is cropping into your actual sensor and not in the lens, so you're losing resolution, but that is something you can do in a pinch. It's one of the coolest features on this camera is being able to program this focus ring to do multiple things. So next, if you hit this left button right here, your film emulation will pop up. In my opinion, this is the coolest part about the camera. So we have the Provia Standard, Vivid, ASTIA Soft, Classic Chrome, ProNeg High, ProNeg Standard, Across, Monochrome, which is just standard monochrome, and sepia. I actually hate sepia. I don't even know why it's in the camera. But I recommend kind of taking your time and learning each profile. There's a little description right here on what each one does, but I recommend kind of just shooting around with all of them and kind of getting a sense of what suits your needs the best. I personally don't like to use Vivid. It's way too saturated, way too contrasty. It looks the best out of camera, so if you don't plan on manipulating your image after the fact, it's a pretty good profile to use. But I personally like using Classic Chrome. It gives you the most interesting looking blues. It's very soft. Everything just kind of feels off, and it's like in an interesting filmic way. And I don't really like ProNeg High. It's too contrasty. I love ProNeg Standard. It's very soft, interesting blues, interesting colors, and it's not very contrasty. It's very soft. Looks really, really good on skin. Those are my two recommendations for what film emulations to use. So let's jump right into how to get good image settings on this camera. Hit the menu button and it'll take you to image quality settings. What you want to do is you want to use these buttons that go up and down to go to image quality. Hit the main button, it'll bring you into quality options. Let me just give you a quick walkthrough into what these options mean. Fine is JPEG, which is a very high quality version of JPEG. Normal is just normal JPEGs. Fine plus raw is raw photos and fine JPEGs. Normal is just normal JPEGs and raw is raw photos. I personally like to shoot with raw or fine at the same time, or at least with raw depending on what I'm doing. If you're someone that doesn't want to do raw editing, I think you'll be fine with just shooting fine, JK. But yeah, so for the time being, let's shoot fine and raw here. And also you'll see image size. You don't want to crop your sensor, because what this will do is it'll give you 16:9, 1:1, 3:2. I recommend shooting the full 3:2 and then cropping into your sensor later, because if you look in the lower left-hand corner here, you'll actually see that the resolution goes down as we crop our sensor. Like if I go to 3:2 in medium, I'm getting less resolution. If I go to 1:1, I'm getting less resolution. If I go to 16:9, I'm only getting 20 megapixels. If you want the full 24 megapixels of your sensor, I recommend shooting in 3:2. That is the best way to maximize the resolution in your sensor. Lastly, let's talk about video. The best and quickest way to get into video is you hit the drive button. And now these are all your drive modes, but I like to just kind of either hit up and go straight into video, or you can do whatever you like. But I like to just hit up, go straight into video mode, and from video mode, I like to set this camera up in a very, very specific way to get good slow motion, good looking video. So first we'll hit menu, we'll scroll down to this video menu, and in video, I like to pick 1080p 69.94p, not 50p, not 29, 60p. This is important, and it's important to make sure you don't pick the 721 by accident. It has to be the full HD 1080. Once you're in that, if you go into autofocus movie mode, I don't really like to do multi or even area. The focus modes in this camera are mediocre. So I personally like to stay with manual focus, but if you're in a bit of a pinch and you really, really need autofocus, area does pretty well because it'll look at everything that's in the frame and it'll give you like a pretty good focus there. From there, what I would do is I would just hit the top button, go back into this, and now you're shooting in 60 frames per second. I would hit this button again and pick a film emulation that I like. Personally, as I mentioned earlier, I like Classic Chrome. Astia Soft is actually okay, but I think I like Classic Chrome better, or Pro Neg Standard. For this example, let's go into Pro Neg Standard. And from there, you hit your Q button, and now you have all of your settings right here at a glance. There's not really much that I would change in here, but if you did want to manipulate your film look a little bit further, you can go into tone, the highlight tone, or your shadow tone, or color. Something that I sometimes like to do, if you mess with this button a little bit, I like to just kind of put my colors off and see if I can get more interesting looking colors or like a weirder look out of the camera without having to do too much work in post. Sometimes it's nice to just shoot in camera and have like a weird look, or like something that's like a little more fresh. Or in this case, we could even shoot in like -4 color, shadow tone. Let's maybe go to +3. As you can see, that's kind of made the image much more contrasty, much darker, and you can just play around in it. But that's one thing that I really like about this camera, is being able to like really customize the settings. Now, the last thing that I want to show you guys is how do you set up this camera so you get phenomenal results, because a lot of times you guys are shooting great stuff, great composition, great ideas, but you don't really just understand the settings, or maybe you're trying to catch a shot and you're just like, oh, I just missed it, I didn't have the right settings on. This is a good way to set up the camera that it's very foolproof, and it will almost guarantee that you will get your shot 9 out of 10 times. What I like to do is I actually like to set my shutter to auto and my ISO to auto, and I just like to have the aperture be the thing that kind of guides everything. Now, what the camera will automatically do, it'll say, okay, the aperture is at, let's say, 4. So based on that, it's gonna correct everything else to work around the aperture. So now I'm going to be able to get that image. And now a lot of times what'll happen is something's whizzing right by you. You know what aperture you want, because let's say you keep it at 5.6, you're doing street photography. You know that you need a 5.6 to get that thing in focus and what kind of depth of field you want, but you just don't have enough time to get the right shutter speed or the right ISO level. But if you have ISO set to auto, shutter speed set to auto, this camera is very quick and smart, and it will just be able to kind of shoot around for you, and it can quickly calculate those things. And if you go back and look at those shots, they're pretty well exposed. I know that's like terrible composition, but I just want to show you guys that this camera can shoot pretty quickly for you. If you just tell it what aperture it needs to be at, it will calculate the rest for you. This camera is very quick, very good, very quick autofocus when it comes to photo, and it will pretty much kind of do 80% of the work for you. So if you're doing street photography or like weddings, or just something where you need to just catch things quickly in the moment, this is how I would keep my camera set up so that I make sure I never miss a single shot. And now lastly, I want to show you guys how to set up this camera for good portraits. Now, to do good portraits, it's slightly different. What I'd like to do is I like to keep the shutter at auto, but I like to set the ISO as low as possible. Sometimes I'll keep it at L, which is 100, or maybe I'll go to like maybe 320. Generally with portraits, you want skin to look really smooth with no grain, so I just like to work with the lowest ISO possible. So in this case, let's go with 200. And now what the camera will do is it has your ISO at 200 locked in. It has your aperture, which is f2.0. Usually with portraits, you want to shoot at a pretty shallow depth of field. So in this case, let's go with 2 or 2.0. Just for funsies, let's kind of split the difference and we'll keep it in the middle. And now it says it's 2.2. And now what I'll do is it will automatically calculate what shutter speed I need to be at. So even if I'm moving around really quickly, it will just quickly calculate the shutter speed. The reason I set the shutter speed to auto is because your subject's probably not going to be moving, but the two things that you have to have constant are your ISO and your aperture. Shutter speed doesn't really matter because you're not worried about motion blur, not worried about the subject moving. So your shutter speed is something that can easily change, and this is a good way to get solid results, and you'll pretty much always nail exposure. Another thing that I want to quickly show you guys, the autofocusing and focusing options in this camera are pretty limited, but they're pretty customizable. What I mean by that is if you hit this middle button right here, you can choose your focus point. So what I generally like to do is I like to keep my focus point in the middle, but you can also expand the range of your focus points. It's not the biggest, but I usually like to keep it as wide as possible right there. And that way, whatever I choose in the center of my frame is generally going to be in focus. As you can see, my battery's dying.